There are cycles that seem too silent to attract attention, but that does not mean they are transformative. January, with its facade of stability and well-defined goals, no longer supports certain internal structures. While the sun remains in Capricorn, encouraging organization and responsibility, a deeper movement begins to happen, almost imperceptible but intense. Pluto, a planet associated with Scorpio and silent transformation, receives direct aspects from the Moon and Mercury this January 16th, activating a collective blind spot. What seemed to work starts to no longer make sense. In astrology, this combination does not bring immediate rupture, but rather a subtle and growing discomfort, as if something is changing without warning. The rational plan begins to lose strength in the face of what cannot be controlled with logic. Conversations become denser, emotions come to the surface for no apparent reason, and that organization so typical of the beginning of the year begins to be questioned by something more visceral. Why am I doing this? Who am I building this for? Does it still make sense? This is the type of transition that is not announced clearly, but leaves traces, and the traces are in the discomfort, in the lack of meaning that appears even in the midst of achievements. This is where the Scorpio energy approaches. It doesn't want goals, it wants truths, and where there is a facade, there will be a breakdown. Many are already feeling this subtle shift, but don't know how to name it. Others just notice that something is out of alignment without understanding why. But for those who follow the signs from heaven, this is all part of a larger cycle that is beginning to reveal itself now. The question remains, what, in your life, is about to stop making sense in the face of this transition? Understanding this movement is more than following astrological predictions. It is recognizing when the internal structure itself begins to ask for renewal. When Pluto moves in tension, it does not destroy on impulse but reveals what was already silently crumbling. It is at this moment that many people, without even realizing it, begin to review priorities, break automatic patterns, and look for answers that no longer fit into cold goals or rigid plans. If this type of transition has already started to resonate with you, whether through questions, emotional fatigue, or that feeling that something needs to change, even without knowing exactly what, then this content can help you name what is happening. Astrology does not dictate rules, but it offers symbolic maps so that you can read your reality in more depth. So leave it in the comments. What do you feel is no longer making sense at the beginning of the year? Your report can help other people identify similar processes. This is how we transform content into collective reflection and not empty consumption. If you noticed something important in this video, like it now and subscribe to the channel. This helps us continue producing content with depth and signals to the algorithm that this type of reflection has value. We are not here to assert absolute truths, but to broaden our view of what affects us from the inside. And when we allow ourselves to look more courageously, we understand that certain changes are not losses. They are invitations to a new cycle that is already underway. In the next few minutes, you will understand why this astrological movement can change precisely what seemed most solid. The initial phase of January usually brings with it a familiar atmosphere: goals, new beginnings, vision boards, organized agendas, and that feeling of now it goes. Capricornian energy, ruled by Saturn, is responsible for this impulse that leads us to structure, to concreteness, to productivity that generates visible pride. But there is something that this same structure does not support, that which pulsates inside without a defined form. And when the internal gears begin to grind, what once seemed like order may turn out to be just a camouflaged repetition of emptiness. From the second half of January onwards, deeper nuances begin to emerge. The astrological aspects involving Pluto and its relationship with Mercury and the Moon move subjective territories. It's no longer about following the plan with excellence. It's about realizing whether this planning is connected to something true. Scorpio's energy begins to touch subtle points in everyday life. It doesn't arrive with a fuss, but with an internal pressure that insists on making us stop. Not because of physical tiredness, but because of emotional incoherence. And that's when a lot of people start to lose their rhythm. They continue producing, delivering, being present, but they no longer feel a sense of purpose in it. The checklist continues to be fulfilled, but the soul disconnects. This phenomenon, which seems silent, is a clear sign of the transition between Capricorn's practical action and Scorpio's need for diving. Scorpio is a fixed water sign, guided by emotional truth and what is experienced intensely, and surface for this energy has no use. It's like trying to survive on shallow oxygen in a sea that requires depth-trained lungs. While the calendar pushes towards goals and executions, astrology shows that this is precisely the time when many of these goals will be tested, but not because of external factors, but because of a kind of internal call that begins to question the real reason for each choice. It's as if a quieter part of consciousness begins to ask, does what I'm doing transform me or just occupy me? Is there any point in continuing to invest energy in something that no longer resonates? Scorpio's symbolic approach reminds us that goals that do not touch the soul become burdens. Well-designed mental structures, but disconnected from emotion, collapse under the pressure of their own dissatisfaction. This is not a planning error. It is a hit of the soul that refuses to continue being ignored. And this refusal does not happen with screams or explosions. It often expresses itself through slight boredom, difficulty concentrating, and a feeling of frustration that is not rationally justified. The mind tries to find reasons. I'm tired. I didn't sleep well. I need to organize myself better. But the truth may be on another layer. You are trying to live a script that was no longer written by you. This transition raises an important question. Does the structure created in January really represent who you are today? Or are you trying to fulfill an old version of yourself, which no longer follows what you feel or what you really want? Scorpio, in this scenario, acts as an emotional magnifying glass, revealing where there is truth and where there is purposeless effort, not as a form of punishment, but as an invitation to honest restructuring. The big trap at this moment is the insistence on keeping everything exactly as it was. But the sky does not support stagnation when Pluto is active. Astrology shows us that in this type of transit, the universe does not force us, it provokes us. He throws disguised questions at everyday events, suggests new perspectives on old routines, and hopes that everyone has the courage to look beyond the surface. This is the essence of Scorpio transformation, not to destroy for the sake of destroying, but to expose what has already lost its function, and what loses function invariably begins to weigh down. That's why so many people feel mental or emotional fatigue during this period, even without doing more than usual. The weight is not in the excess of tasks, but in the disconnection between what is done and what makes sense. The paradox is that in this scenario, many try to regain control by redoubling planning, increasing commitments, reinforcing routine, as if more structure would solve the emptiness of the soul. But this attempt tends to worsen internal distancing, because according to Scorpio's logic, the more you run away from the truth, the more it imposes itself through discomfort. And the truth that Scorpio brings is not comfortable, but it is liberating. It does not require you to abandon everything, but rather that you recognize what no longer vibrates at the same frequency. May you have the courage to review choices that seemed right, but were made in another moment of consciousness. May you look at your January goals and ask, honestly, does this path still serve me or just sustain me? The most interesting thing is that this movement does not happen in a chaotic way. Contrary to what many people think, Scorpion energy is silent, deep, and patient. She doesn't demand haste. It demands presence. And presence in this context means listening to what you have been avoiding feeling. It's accepting that you can no longer maintain pacts with old ways of living that no longer reflect who you are today. Therefore, this is not a period to create new goals. It is a time to review the ones you have already established. It's a time to observe where your energy is, and whether it is being invested in something that nourishes you or just drains you. It's the ideal time to realize that productivity without purpose is just repetition, disguised as advancement, and that planning too much, without listening to your own sensitivity, can be a sophisticated form of self-abandonment. At this point in the month, astrology offers a symbolic mirror, not an immutable prediction. There are no promises or guarantees, but there is a cyclical pattern that repeats itself, and which, if observed carefully, can show you where you are insisting on remaining shallow when, in fact, life is calling you to dive. If you've come this far, it's because some part of this movement is alive in you, and this is the perfect time to ask yourself honestly, what have you been doing that feels right but no longer resonates? What structures in your life are still standing only out of habit and not out of truth? And what do you feel but haven't had the courage to name yet? Share here in the comments which part of this content is most touched you. Your opinion is essential so that this space continues to be a meeting point for those looking for meaning, not just ready-made answers. Write how this moment has manifested itself in your life. And if this video spoke to you, like it now and subscribe to the channel. There are times when discomfort doesn't ask for permission. It just arrives. Subtle at first, like a discomfort that cannot be explained in words, but that begins to inhabit gestures, thoughts, and even silences. And in this second half of January, especially between the 16th and 21st, this discomfort begins to occupy space in many people, not as something out of the ordinary, but as a presence that refuses to be ignored. Astrology points to this period as a symbolic milestone of disconnection between what is experienced and what is felt. The sky moves silently but directly, touching emotional layers that have been dormant since the beginning of the year. Scorpio, intense energy by nature, begins to make its presence known not with urgency, but with depth. And when this depth touches something that had been ignored, it is inevitable. Discomfort manifests itself. This is not a tragedy, nor a crisis. This is a symbolic break with what is being carried forward by inertia. The sign of Scorpio, ruled by Pluto and traditionally associated with what is intense, does not tolerate emotional superficialities. He is not satisfied with rational explanations, nor with the "everything is fine" that disguises the accumulation of frustration. When this energy kicks in, everything that has been pushed to the bottom begins to bubble back to the surface, and not in revenge, but in revelation. It is in this scenario that many people begin to feel out of place within their own routine. Activities that were previously automatic start to seem disconnected. Simple commitments breed resistance. Relationships that had been maintained out of habit begin to seem empty, even exhausting, not because something new has happened, but because the old is no longer sustainable. According to astrology, this is the typical effect of Scorpio's influence when it connects with other points in the sky. It brings to light what was camouflaged. This discomfort is not a punishment, but an invitation, a call to listen to what no longer makes sense with the same attention given to plans and obligations. It's as if the soul begins to whisper that it is tired of pretending normality. Fatigue turns into disinterest. Disinterest turns into irritation, and the irritation exposes the disconnect that has been ignored since the beginning of the month or perhaps even before. During this period, it is common for a specific type of anguish to arise, one that has no clear cause, an anxiety that is not justified by external circumstances but that springs from within. The feeling of being in the right place and at the same time out of place, of being with the right people but feeling lonely, to continue doing what you've always done, but with an emptiness that insists on growing. Astrology teaches us that this type of feeling is usually a sign of a mismatch between the external cycle and the internal cycle. While the world revolves with goals, productivity, and control, the internal universe begins to ask for silence, pause, presence. And it is in this tension between doing and feeling that the transition intensifies. What previously went unnoticed now begins to bother you. Dissatisfaction infiltrates everyday tasks, conversations, and even leisure time, because it's not the external that needs to change, it's the way you inhabit what you experience. Scorpio demands total presence, and when he realizes that we are living in half, he reacts, not to destroy, but to reveal. In this context, the desire to disappear, to get away from everything, should not be confused with escape. It is often an internal request for space, space to rethink, space to reorient yourself, to understand what is being lived with truth and what is being maintained out of emotional obligation. And when this space is not granted, the body and mind begin to show signs: persistent tiredness, apathy, irritability, even physical symptoms that seem to have no explanation. The January 2026 sky is activating this point. Precisely. The tension between Pluto, Mercury, and the Moon not only moves mental and emotional aspects, it opens internal portals that bring us face to face with what we avoid feeling, not out of malice, but out of necessity for survival. It turns out that now what used to serve as armor is starting to weigh too much to carry, and this perception can be disconcerting, especially for those who are still very attached to the logic of control. For those who learned that feeling too much is weakness, or that changing your mind is a sign of inconstancy. Scorpio in this sense does not negotiate. He demands authenticity. And authenticity here isn't a pretty performance. It's the ability to admit to yourself that something has changed, that something that made sense in December no longer talks to Jane Iroh, that there is an internal movement happening, even though the external world continues at the same pace. Therefore, it is natural that during this period, many people begin to question their relationships, their work, their own motivations, not by impulse but by saturation. And it is important to recognize that these questions are not a mistake along the way. They are part of the process itself. They do not arise to destroy what was built, but to test whether what was built still supports the person you are becoming. Spiritual astrology reminds us that every discomfort is also a compass. It points to something that is out of alignment, even if appearance says otherwise. He pokes where there is inconsistency. He breaks the rhythm to reveal what is being experienced on autopilot. And when Scorpio activates this energy, there's no way to ignore it for long. Sooner or later, life begins to feel too tight for the size of the soul. This is the moment when old stories begin to come to an end without fuss. They just stop. Friendships that dissolve without a fight. Projects that lose their shine for no concrete reason. Dreams that used to make your eyes shine are now just tiring. Is this collapse? No. This is transition. It is the symbolic language of the universe signaling that new meanings are being summoned, and that for them to emerge, it is necessary to let go of what no longer speaks to the now. It is in this gap between what is no longer useful and what has not yet been revealed that the real challenge of this phase lies, sustaining the void, the space between an old version and another that is still being born. This is a territory where the mind tends to seek immediate answers, but where the soul only wants time and silence. And when we can respect that time, when we stop trying to force clarity where there is still mystery, we begin to realize that discomfort is in fact a sign of life, a sign that something within us is still willing to change, to grow, to seek another way of existing. It is this subtle space between discomfort and transformation that we need to learn to inhabit, because it is there that the most sincere decisions are born. It is in him that something new begins to form, still without a name but already full of power. Now that you've followed this part of the process, I want to know, which aspect of this movement have you felt most strongly? What has started to lose its meaning in the last few days? Share your experience here in the comments. Your perception can light the path of other people who are also going through this moment without being able to name it. When we reach this point in the transition, the signs begin to become clearer, even if they are still silent. Ties, bonds, alliances, everything that until then seemed stable or resolved begins to emit small alerts. There are no immediate breakups, no sentimental disasters. What happens is more subtle and at the same time deeper, an emotional disconnection that begins to erode the meaning of what was previously shared. Relationships built on habits, social obligations, or pure convenience come into natural revision when Scorpio energy gains strength in the sky. Not because Scorpio causes separations, this is a shallow reading, but because this archetype symbolizes the purification of what is false, what is shallow, what was sustained only to maintain appearances or fulfill roles. Scorpio acts as a spiritual filter that separates what has a soul from what only has function, and everything that remains just for function begins to silently get sick. It's not just about romantic relationships. We are talking about all types of commitments, friendships, professional partnerships, family relationships, old emotional pacts. As this transit intensifies, the relational field enters a kind of energetic sieve, and everything that doesn't vibrate with sincerity, everything that was once useful but today only serves as a frame, begins to weigh down. The feeling can be of suffocation, of social exhaustion, of wanting to move away for no apparent reason, but the reason exists, and it is spiritual. There is an energetic disavowal of what no longer pulses with truth, and this disempowerment does not come in anger. She arrives tired. This is where many people enter into internal conflict, trying to recover old ties that, however important they may have been, no longer keep up with their new frequency. And it is in this attempt to save what has already ended in the subtle field that precious energy is spent. Because while we insist on keeping alive what has already completed its cycle, something essential fails to be born. Something that needs your space, your listening, your courage to admit. It no longer feeds me. In spiritual astrology, when we say that Scorpio considers the superficial as something toxic, we are not talking about moral judgment. We are talking about intensity as a compass. Scorpio needs the truth L as a form of survival. He does not breathe well in environments where everything is maintained by appearance, by forced diplomacy, by maintaining collective comfort to the detriment of individual authenticity. And when this energy begins to dominate celestial transits, even those who do not have strong Scorpio in their chart feel the impact, the need to face the bonds that no longer support the soul. This process can seem challenging because it involves reviewing promises, remaking agreements with yourself, breaking silent pacts with old versions of your identity. But it is also a process of liberation, because it returns us to what is essential, and what is essential never weighs. What weighs heavily is the attempt to keep alive a dynamic that no longer communicates with the person you have become. It is very common for subtle conflicts to arise in relationships during this period, not explicit fights, but discomforts that seem to grow out of nowhere. Dialogues that used to flow easily now become tense. Small gestures start to bother you. There is a lack of patience, a lack of harmony, a lack of listening, but the question is not about each other. The issue is within. It is the spiritual energy itself asking for revision, asking for space for something more coherent with its current vibration. The most delicate thing is that many of these relationships are not in themselves toxic. They're just too old, built in different contexts, supported by expectations that no longer make sense, by emotional patterns that you have already overcome. The challenge is precisely in recognizing that the relationship may have been beautiful, it may have been true, but perhaps it has ended. And it's okay to end something that was once good, but isn't anymore. This is why Scorpio energy, when entering with more intensity, demands emotional maturity. She doesn't want you to run away or break up impulsively. She wants you to feel. May you recognize where coherence is and where just custom is. May you have the courage to stay where there is true exchange, but also the courage to leave where there is only social function. Because every bond that does not transform consumes. And when a commitment starts to consume your energy without giving you growth, it stops being a link and becomes a prison. This type of process requires presence. It requires you to be willing to revisit your intentions, to listen to your intuition, not to judge, but to understand. Why do I still maintain this bond? What, in fact, am I trying to preserve? Fear of losing or real desire to continue? Many responses will be accompanied by silence, others with sincere tears. And that's part of the way. It is part of the spiritual realignment that this phase proposes. Heaven does not require quick decisions. He proposes deep reflections. It offers the opportunity to reevaluate everything that takes up space in your emotional field. And from this reassessment, clarity emerges. You may realize that a bond still has potency, but needs new agreements. You may notice that a relationship that seemed cold is actually asking for reconnection. And you can understand, with respect, that some ties have come to an end. And that doesn't mean failure. It means energetic maturity. During these days, don't be alarmed if you feel like withdrawing into yourself, avoiding social conversations, preferring silence over meetings. This is not isolation. This is natural introspection asking for passage. It's your vibrational field trying to find a new balance, away from unnecessary noise. It's your spirit wanting to hear what your body and mind were suppressing. When this silence is allowed, something begins to reorganize inside. A new sensitivity emerges. You start to notice small differences in the way you feel people's presence, understand where there is lightness and where there is only demand. And this perception becomes a guide, an internal radar that points out where it is worth staying and where it is necessary to let go. Now that you've had this time to reflect with me, tell me here in the comments, do you feel that any relationship in your life is going through this type of review? Have any bonds lost their meaning, even without major conflicts? Share your perception. This not only strengthens your inner listening, but can also help other people understand what they are feeling in this same cycle. When celestial movements place Mercury on a direct route through Capricorn, there is a promise of clarity, structure, and ordering of ideas. But this clarity now no longer comes from the logic of the practical world. It comes from less visible layers, and therefore more intense. Mercury, this planet that governs thought, communication, and mental flows, becomes crossed by symbolic forces, especially when touched by Neptune and Pluto. And this astrological combination generates a very specific effect. Thoughts lose the rigidity of the rational and become permeated by symbols, intuitions, images, and feelings that cannot be explained, only understood in the body. It is a moment when the linear mind loses space for a more fluid, often mystical, perception. Another type of listening begins to emerge, one that perceives what is behind words, what vibrates between gestures, what insinuates itself into everyday details. And that is exactly why, during this period, dreams gain unusual strength. They are not just random fragments of the unconscious mind, as reductionist explanations usually say. They are messages, spiritual impressions, subtle codes that bring clues about what needs to be seen, closed, crossed, or accepted. The nights become more full of symbolic images. Many people start to dream about old places, people they haven't seen in a long time, situations that seemed forgotten. These dreams come as reunions, not to bring nostalgia, but to open space for deeper understandings. There are dreams that arrive with faces, voices, and atmospheres so vivid that when you wake up, it is difficult to believe that you didn't actually experience it. These are experiences that remain in the body, that change the state of mind throughout the day, even without a logical explanation. And this doesn't happen by chance. According to spiritual knowledge that cuts across different cultures and traditions, there are specific moments when the material plane becomes more porous. And this is one of those moments. The curtain between the visible and the invisible thins. Silence begins to carry messages that only those who are attentive can capture. It is as if something, what many call spirituality, the universe, the subtle, field, inner guidance, begins to approach the surface of everyday life. But contrary to what is expected, this approach does not come with noise, urgency, or spectacles. It comes in whispers. It is in this silence that so many people begin to realize that there is an inner voice trying to communicate. A voice that doesn't scream, but doesn't shut up either. It appears in the pause between one thought and another. That inexplicable feeling that there is something out of place. In that shiver that comes from nowhere. In that certainty that arises in the body even when the mind doubts. This voice has no form, no script, no ready-made language. But she insists, she plays, she pokes. It invites deeper listening. The curious thing is that this voice often appears in moments when we are alone, distracted, tired, or have no expectations. It appears when the mental defense relaxes, when the pace slows down, when rationality gives way to presence. And that's why it's so neglected, because it doesn't follow the rules that we've learned to value. It comes not with logic but with truth, and truth at this stage of heaven, it doesn't come with absolute certainty. It comes with subtle sensations that refuse to be ignored. It is very common for a type of heightened emotional sensitivity to emerge during this transit. People start to get emotional over simple things. They miss times they can't even name. They notice synchronicities more frequently. They look at the clock and see repeated numbers. They hear the same phrase in different places. They receive coincidences that carry messages. These are all forms of symbolic communication from the invisible field. These are ways in which life tries to speak when words are no longer enough. And the more you resist listening, the more difficult it becomes to deal with everyday life. This is because this phase is not for those who want to protect themselves from their own sensitivity. It is for those who accept that feeling is a legitimate path to wisdom. We are not talking about superficial sentimentality, but about refined listening to one's own soul. Listening to yourself at this point in traffic is not about making decisions in a hurry. It's about noticing internal movements before they turn into symptoms. It's about preventing what could be understood in silence from becoming a conflict due to lack of attention. It is at this moment that the body also begins to speak, and not just through tiredness or pain, but through very specific reactions, palpitations in front of certain people, chills in certain environments, an inexplicable desire to cry or smile for no reason. They are forms of energetic communication. The body, as an extension of the soul, captures before the mind understands, and what the mind usually calls strange or random is often just a message that has not yet been translated. Mercury, being the messenger of the zodiac, when influenced by Pluto and Neptune, stops being just the one who explains and becomes the one who connects worlds. It begins to operate on another level, where messages are not transmitted by words, but by states of consciousness. And that's why writing, meditation, silence, and contemplation become so powerful at this stage. They create space for information to arrive unfiltered, so that the inner truth reveals itself without noise. Maybe you are already feeling all of this. Maybe your thoughts are denser, looser, the most poetic ones even. Maybe you're feeling a sudden urge to write what you feel, or to step away from other people's opinions for a while to listen to what really vibrates inside you. This is not withdrawal. This is alignment. Alignment with your own rhythm, with your own inner language, with your most intimate spiritual connection. And it's not necessary to understand everything now. The mind will always want quick answers, but the soul works at other times. That is why, during this transit, it is wiser to welcome the signs than to rush to interpret them, because often, the message only reveals itself completely after we have already accepted that it exists. If this moment has manifested itself in your life in a sensitive way, if you have noticed dreams that are more loaded with meaning, constant synchronicities, or simply an intuition that guides you even without proof, share in the comments how this has shown itself to you. Your experience can be the mirror that someone needs to recognize their own signs. When this stage of the cycle sets in, the most present feeling is not exactly of loss, but of emptying. Not a sad emptying, nor a sudden one, but a kind of silent separation between what you still represent and what, inside, no longer inhabits your truth. There is a time when we wear a role for so long that we forget that it was one day a choice. And this transition that Scorpio causes does not come to destroy your story. It comes to make you listen to what no longer vibrates, even if it is still standing. When we talk about letting go of what is static, we need to go beyond the common idea of letting go of objects, clothes, places. Here we talk about something much more intimate, letting go of the roles that were useful, but that now imprison. Roles of who can handle everything, of who needs to be strong all the time, of who has to keep everything under control. These are social and emotional roles that we create for survival, for belonging, for the need for affection or approval. But over time, they turned into armor, weigh, limit, and even if they have served for a long time, there are times when they simply stop making sense. This is a profound process, which is not always visible to outsiders. Sometimes everything remains the same in everyday life, but inside, something is loosening, a tiredness of maintaining speeches that no longer correspond to what we live, a subtle irritation with commitments that no longer speak to the soul, a growing desire to do something different, even if you don't yet know what. This is not confusion. This is energetic rupture with that which has stopped in time within you. Scorpio, at this point in the cycle, begins to act like a mirror. It shows you clearly where you still insist on carrying old ways of being that no longer represent your current truth. And it's not about rejecting who you were, but about honoring the evolution that is asking for passage. Because when something in you matures, what used to feel right starts to feel tight. This goes for spiritual beliefs, for emotional habits, for worldviews, for automatic responses that you gave without even thinking. Letting what is stagnant die does not mean breaking with everything at once. Esoteric astrology teaches us that this type of transformation happens like a snake shedding its skin, silent, inevitable, and absolutely necessary for the being to continue growing. The old skin needs to be left behind, not because it is wrong, but because it has already fulfilled its function. This movement is as symbolic as it is concrete. It affects how you position yourself in the world, how you see yourself, how you present yourself. It often manifests itself in the form of discomfort with one's own speech, with the environments one frequents, with the routines one maintains. It can even appear as a difficulty in recognizing yourself in your own plans. That project that made sense now seems forced. That path you have been following begins to seem too predictable, without a soul, without room for something new. This is a clear indication that the created character is asking for closure, and this character, however necessary it may have been at some point, can no longer lead your journey if it does not represent your current essence. The soul begins to show signs that it wants to appear more, and the essence, when it begins to emerge, no longer accepts old frames. It is common that at this moment we feel between two worlds. The old one has not yet been completely left behind, but the new one has not yet revealed itself clearly. This interval is uncomfortable, but it is also fertile. It is there that the seeds of a new expression begin to germinate. It's when you realize that you no longer believe in the same things, that you no longer want the same roles, that you no longer fit into the same logic. This point in the journey can also affect deep identity ties. Maybe you even begin to question your place within groups of which you have always been a part. There may be a certain strangeness with the work environment, with family dynamics, with ideals that previously guided your choices. This is all part of the symbolic death process that Scorpio rules. Because for something more authentic to be born, what is stagnant needs to be released with awareness. And it's important to say, this doesn't happen like an impulsive breakup. The spirituality linked to this archetype teaches that death is not absence, but transition. You don't lose who you were. You integrate, honor, transform. Scorpio energy asks for presence to observe these closures with dignity, without rejection, without a rush to rebuild. Because it is in this void that the soul finally finds space to breathe, to manifest more clearly, to say who you are becoming, without the conditioning that limited you before. Many people are afraid of this emptiness because they have been taught to fill any silence with movement. But this is a creative silence, a space where life can reorganize itself based on who you really are now, and no longer who you once needed to be. It is in this interval that answers begin to appear, not as ready-made solutions, but as sensations of direction, a new interest, a subtle call, a desire to try something different without having to explain why. This type of transformation, silent and profound, is not the most visible, but it's the one that changes your vibration the most. When you start to let go of roles, habits, fixed beliefs, you also start to attract new connections, new inspirations, new paths. The external begins to reorganize itself in response to what is adjusting within. And this is a clear sign that detachment from the static is creating real space for what has movement, fluidity, life. Not every transformation needs to be noisy. Not every process needs to be exposed or explained. And this is precisely what marks this last phase of the transition, the need for a conscious, almost ritualistic withdrawal, a type of silence that is not absence but preparation, a time when the soul asks to talk less and listen more, a time in which it is not about chasing, but about allowing the essential to reveal itself as the noise of the world is silenced. When Scorpio energy stabilizes at the end of this cycle, it no longer requires immediate ruptures, questions, or letting go. Now the call is different, to remain silent enough to feel what actually still lives inside. The truth is that after so many layers turned over, after so many discomforts embraced, after so many bonds revisited, after so many versions undone, something calms down. And this stillness is not inertia, it is presence. It is the wisdom of not filling empty space in a hurry, not rushing to the next plan just to avoid the discomfort of not knowing. Because this moment calls for this, tolerating, not knowing. Welcome the break, and make this break active listening. Introspection here is neither withdrawal nor escape. It is spiritual strategy. It's like the land that after being plowed needs to rest before receiving new seed. Anything released prematurely will not germinate strongly. Therefore, the invitation now is not to act, it's to understand. Observe the subtle signs that life delivers. Notice what moves without noise. Pay attention to internal sensations, to the silent conversations that arise when the mind slows down. When Scorpio reaches this point in the process, he has already cleared much of what was dense and now turns to what is yet to be born. Not in the outside world, but within the emotional, energetic, intuitive field. Astrology understands this part of the path as the period in which one enters a symbolic cocoon, an intimate space outside of time, where the soul reorganizes everything that has been undone. It is in this cocoon that memories are rewritten, beliefs dissolve, and a new language begins to emerge, more organic, more aligned, more sensitive to what is true. And this truth here does not need to be blatant. It just needs to be felt honestly. It is at this moment that reconnection happens, not as an event, but as a series of small internal recognitions. It starts with the realization that certain opinions that previously influenced you now pass right by, or that what distressed you no longer touches you with the same force. It starts with silence becoming comfortable, with the desire not to say everything, to keep some discoveries for yourself, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Because what is born at this point in the process is not to be explained. It is to be experienced. The truth that Scorpio reveals is not an answer, but an inner direction, a compass that points not to where you should go, but to what you can no longer ignore within yourself. And this reconnection movement can happen in unexpected ways. Sometimes it's in the middle of a song. Sometimes in a memory that comes back with another meaning. Or that moment when you are alone and feel that despite everything, there is a silent presence accompanying you, something that holds you, anchors you, even when there are no clear explanations. That's when you realize you are reconnecting with what is essential in you, with something that does not depend on performance, validation, or control. This fertile silence begins to reorganize your rhythm. Suddenly, you are no longer in a rush to solve everything. You feel like you can wait, that you can breathe before responding. Who can say no without guilt? And, above all, you can change your route if you feel that the previous one no longer speaks to your truth. This is the most refined point of the Scorpio cycle. The ability to rebuild oneself without fuss, to reorganize yourself inside without the world needing to know. And it is precisely in this silence that the basis for the new cycle to come is created. A cycle more aligned with who you have become after all the layers that are no longer part of who you are. During this part of the journey, many people feel the desire to spend more time alone, to rethink their choices, to change their rhythms. It's natural, it's expected, because reconnection doesn't happen in noise. It happens in the space you give yourself to listen to yourself deeply. And this listening requires courage, because often the first thing that appears in silence is discomfort. But if you stay, if you sustain the silence for a little longer, you start to hear something else. You begin to hear a firmer, clearer, more serene voice. And that voice is yours, not the one that was shaped by others, but the one that was covered by all the layers that have now been dissolved. This inner voice doesn't come with promises, but with guidance. It doesn't tell you what to do, but it shows you where you can no longer stay. And that alone changes everything, because when you clearly recognize what no longer serves you, what you have left is truer, more solid, lighter. Reconnection in this context is not with an idealized self, but with a feeling that was hidden, a feeling that does not need explanations or justifications. He just needs to be respected. It's common that at this point, you begin to have more clarity about what you want to say yes to, and most importantly, what you need to say no to. And most importantly, this clarity does not come from the mind, but from the body. Intuition begins to become your main guide. Decisions are now taken not by logic but by energetic coherence, and that changes everything. You stop reacting and start responding with presence, acting with intention, not impulse, feeling before planning, to choose not out of fear of making mistakes, but with the commitment to be faithful to what you feel. And it is in this internal fidelity that a new field opens up, a field where the next choices begin to be designed with more coherence, where the new is not an escape from the old, but a natural unfolding of everything you've worked on, where the next steps are no longer defined by obligation but by harmony. That's when you understand that true action comes from silence, that before any plan, you need to listen to yourself, that before any movement, you need to reconnect. If you've stayed with me this far, this already says a lot about your search for awareness, depth, and inner truth. And if this content made sense to you in some way, take advantage of this moment and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next reflections to come. Leave your like now. This really helps to strengthen this space and take this message to more people who, like you, feel that there is something bigger moving inside. And before you leave, check out the next video that is already appearing here on the left side of your screen. It is the natural continuation of this journey we are living together. I'll wait for you there.